Hi, everybody. Welcome to week 2 of the Sustainability Teachers Academy online. I'm here with Molly Cashin.
Hi.
And we're going to continue our talk about locust as a sustainability problem. And we've got some really interesting sound clips from an interview with Dr. Arianne Cease. Molly, who is Dr. Arianne Cease?
Dr. Arianne Cease is an associate professor in the School of Sustainability and also a senior sustainability scientist with the Global Institute of Sustainability. Both of those are housed here at Arizona State University.
And Dr. Cease is easily one of the world's experts.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So another thing is that ASU has the largest locust lab in the world, holding 5 different species of locust in one place.
And we've seen them all. We've actually got to take a look at all 5 species.
Yeah, I bet if Rob tries really hard, he can put a picture of us holding locusts on this slide.
I guess. Anyway, so we talked with Dr. Cease about locusts and about her work, in particular her work trying to figure out what all the different factors that are involved in understanding locusts as a sustainability problem. And just to kind of give you guys a recap of what we talked about last week. So locusts are a type of grasshopper that under certain environmental conditions, a genetic switch flips and all of a sudden they become this huge, massive swarm of ravenous locusts that go all over the world and try to eat everything that they can. And so we talked about a couple of different ways you can imagine this, like 60 to 80 million locusts in a single swarm, being the equivalent of seeing, like every elephant in Africa coming to eat your crops if you're a farmer. Dr. Cease actually described the largest locust swarm ever recorded, and this happened in the United States, and her description of it just blew us away. So I'm going to play a quick clip of her description of this massive locust swarm.
Actually, the largest plague ever recorded was in North America. It was the Rocky Mountain locust, now extinct, so you don't have to worry about it. But it was about the size of the state of California, and about a kilometer thick. So you can think about what that must feel like to be a farmer and have that.
Wait a minute.
What do you mean? Hold on.
State of California.
What do you mean by kilometer thick? Like high?
Quarter kilometer.
Like up in the air. Like
right,
so between.
Up in the air.
So this is the entire state of California, a quarter kilometer thick slice of it, like flying,
right? Yeah.
Flying over the.
Wait, when was this?
I can't remember the exact year, but that would have been the late 1800s.
So Molly, can you even imagine a swarm the size of California that is a quarter of a kilometer thick?
No.
But you did a quick calculation to come up with a comparison in terms of building height, right? So
I did, yeah. And so I found that a quarter of a kilometer is 250 meters, a little bit of basic, what's that thing? King Henry died drinking chocolate milk? Anyways.
I have no idea I don't know what you're talking about.
That's the way that you calculate kilometers to meters and KH. Anyways.
I always just use a conversion table.
Okay, so I did that calculation, and it turns out that a quarter of a kilometer is just over the equivalent of a 60-story office building.
So imagine a 60-story building, or if you're not capable of imagining a 60-story building, you could imagine 6 10-story buildings stacked.
Just to give you... okay, so I'm having a hard time doing that.
How many blue whales?
So, the tallest building in Phoenix is 40 stories. That's Chase Tower. So a locust swarm would effectively be like from the ground of Phoenix and then taller than the tallest building in downtown Phoenix. It would be equivalent of 100 blue whales stacked on top of each other. That's a pretty good calculation.
Yeah, so here's the problem. Neither of us have a 60-story building in our vicinity to compare to. And then we also have never seen a blue whale. Right. So I really don't know the value. I don't understand the value of these calculations. But the elephant thing worked because I think we know what an elephant... We have this idea of what an elephant... Anyway.
Elephants are huge. How tall are elephants?
The equivalent of 80,000 adult elephants stacked end to end.
Which would be higher than any building in Phoenix.
Okay, so moving on. Dr. Cease indicated, too, that those are now extinct, largely probably due to human activity, habitat destruction, essentially, as humans moved into the western United States and started to convert the natural environment into agricultural land, and so their population collapsed, and we don't have those anymore. And so that doesn't seem to be a risk for most other species of locusts. Most other species of locusts are that are alive today seem to live in places that are not of real value to us economically or for agricultural purposes or anything like that. And it's only when they sort of have a population explosion and that they move out. Yeah, the boom bust cycle, and they move out into parts of the world that we actually utilize, that they become a real problem. And so
another thing that she said that was quite interesting, specifically that I want to highlight about the Rocky Mountain locust plague, was one of the social implications that so when these locusts came, many people still saw this as a biblical kind of event, and so so they kind of saw this as something that the farmers may have brought on themselves for any range of potential like sins that they may have committed, and were not offered aid because of kind of this social idea that plagues are associated with negative, biblical things. And so that to me was really fascinating, because it has this whole other element of a social component that, like, if you are affected by plagues, there's this deep-seated understanding based on historical religious texts that you have done something to deserve it. And therefore, in the case of the Rocky Mountain locust, those people that suffered like crop losses due to the plague, they were unable to get aid because of this social construction.
yeah, there's an interesting connection between locusts in nature and locusts in historically sacred texts like the Bible, for example. And so it's very difficult, I think, for people to sort of separate what they have understood about locusts from their religious perspective from maybe their the natural explanation or the natural systems that are impacting locust swarms. So, in fact, we're just now starting to understand why locusts form plagues and why those events happen. It's a complicated system to try to work through.
So when we're talking about what makes a huge locust swarm, one way that we can approach this is based on our training in sustainability science to understand the three pillars. So social and environmental and economic. And so maybe we can go through each of the pillars and then talk about how each, like, kind of looking at this in a way that highlights how these different components influence and impact the creation of a boom cycle for a locust species.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So certainly there are environmental conditions that have an impact on whether or not locusts form swarms. And so one of the things that Dr. Cease talked about is that locusts prefer hot, dry conditions.
So something else that Arianne said that was quite interesting is that there are about 25 known species of locusts today. And something that she said was that there are many locusts that have kind of like cropped up that weren't really on humans' radar before this like big, basically our boom cycle, the human boom cycle as far as population goes.
Right. She actually said something along the lines of, these are species that weren't known to become locusts before. Mm-hmm. Human activity played a role, and now due to human activity, they actually form plagues as the result of our environmental impact.
Yeah, and we don't know exactly what that is, but we can see that there is some kind of correlation between increase in humans and increase in plagues.
We have about 20 to 25 species of locusts, and some of the locusts we work on in particular weren't actually recorded or known to be locusts before about the 1950s, something like that. And these are the locusts that we think are associated with land degradation, land use change. And even the Australian plague locust, which is sometimes considered the main pest of Australia, there's no records of it before about 100 years ago. And so one hypothesis is that through clearing a forest for agriculture, they're a grass-living species, grass-eating species, that we actually created more habitat for them. And so that enabled them to build up populations enough to where they would actually, have pretty significant impacts.
So environmentally, locust already exists. Like, they have boom and bust cycles. This is a species that is integral to ecological processes. It is not something like, many people have been talking a lot about the mosquito and how we can eradicate the mosquito in certain places because it doesn't have an a meaningful ecological contribution, but with the locust, they do.
So let's hear from Dr. Cease on how locusts may have an impact on the environment.
Locust plagues have been a part of ecosystems for thousands of years. They evolved with the grasshoppers evolved with the grasslands. They've been having all kinds of population boom busts, all sorts of cycles. And some people have argued that during an outbreak, locusts may be considered a keystone species. So they feed a lot of migrating birds. I mean, let's see, spiders, ants, rodents, many kinds of birds, people, anything that can kind of wrap their hands around locusts will eat them. Locusts and grasshoppers. They're also, as I mentioned earlier, locusts and grasshoppers are really important for nutrient cycling. And so you have locusts come through, they eat locally, so they might eat the grass and plants locally, and then they create these nice little small particles called frass, which is basically their poop. And that is very easily integrated into the soil and can quickly be taken up by more plants. So one thing that they can do is if they're feeding on a dominant plant that would otherwise outcompete everything else, they can actually increase diversity in an ecosystem. Another trick that probably happens is they probably transport nutrients across the landscape. So if you have a locust plague come in, they might, for example, in Australia, you might have locusts eating plants in the outback and then flying into the cropping areas, and then eventually that generation will die, and then their nutrients will go back into the soil, that kind of thing.
And then, so other environmental factors that we want to talk about here are highlighting that there have been more locusts are primarily located in hot and dry areas.
Right. And so as we start to see significant changes in climate worldwide, we're actually seeing certain parts of the world become hotter and drier. And this is good news for locusts because that's the habitat that they like. But that also might come along with more of those large swarms that form that have an impact on human activities like agriculture. So one of the things that we should think about is how the environment contributes to the formation of a locust swarm. Mm-hmm. We mentioned last week that locusts begin as these solitary grasshoppers that eat food and really don't move around too much. But one of the things that happens is that when their food becomes sort of clumped in the environment instead of uniformly spread out through the environment, what we see is that locusts actually become crowded together. Mm-hmm. And it's that crowding that seems to make them convert into the gregarious form of the locust.
And so something interesting to note here is that we can try to siphon off, look at things primarily from one pillar and then another pillar, but you can't separate them out. That's kind of what makes, that's kind of like the basis of Chan's research, is that it's coupled human and natural systems. You can't pick out, there is an environmental process that is occurring, but we are no longer able to separate that from the social and economic impact.
Right. So think about how changes in the available diet might have an impact on the formation of swarms. And Dr. Cease actually tells us about how raising livestock may impact the boom and bust life cycle of the locust.
And I thought that if I understood how, what are the environmental triggers of locust plagues, maybe we can make better prediction models. Maybe if we know locusts are coming, we could plant crops that are not as susceptible, those kinds of things. And I went off sort of naively out to the Inner Mongolian grasslands to study the Mongolian locust, and found pretty quickly that there were actually really close ties between people and locusts, and specifically between how land was being managed and where the locusts were. So every time we went to collect the locusts, it was always in these heavily grazed fields. And that wasn't particularly novel in and of itself, but what we found was the mechanism linking those two, which is consistent, continuous stocking of livestock. Eventually will lead to degraded soils. You lose nitrogen in the soil, and you end up with plants that tend to have a lower protein content, lower protein, higher carb. So it's kind of like your donut diet. And as it turns out, locusts love and thrive on this diet. And if you feed them a high protein diet, like the Atkins diet, for example, it kills them. So they have a pretty high mortality rate on that. So we found this cool link, and then we thought, well, there's, we have a dial that we can think about turning for management. So it's a lot easier to control or think about our land management practices than it is controlling the weather. Which is, a more traditional way about thinking about, predicting when locust plagues are going to come and that sort of thing. And certainly weather and climate is a huge factor. But we found that connection between land management, and suddenly there was a door open to find alternative management strategies. And in that, thinking about the broader system in which locusts sit. So how locusts affect people, how people affect locusts, how regional and national policies affect the people and their decision making, how do communities allocate their natural resources, how do they decide who should graze where and at what intensity, and should there be rotations, and all of those things. How is it economically viable to manage land in a way that suppresses locusts? So if you just go to a farmer and say, okay, take 20 sheep off your land, of course that can be a huge economic hit to them as well. So immediately we see that, this is a very complex, wicked problem. There's all these different, all this connectivity, and how are we going to manage for all of these, multiple outcomes that we're looking for.
People have this idea of locusts that they seek out crops, that they have a direction, and that is not true. It turns out that locusts don't really have a direction when they start to swarm and fly. They just pick a place and go.
They just sort of launch into the air, and they rely on the prevailing winds to move them over great distances. And so you may have one small swarm of locusts that gets blown across the environment to another region, and then once they get there, they start the whole cycle again of converting the grasshoppers that are there into locusts. And then once again, they launch into the air, they get blown around. And all of these little swarms are sort of getting blown together by the prevailing winds to become one massive swarm.
One of the other ways that I like to visualize these three pillars is through what we call a nested system. And so in our nested system, we have the environment on the outside, because the environment surrounds both social and the economic pillars of sustainability. And so we have the environment surrounding all of us, and then we have inside that the social, and then we can just have a visual here. But what you can see in this visual is that the economy is inside the social sphere. So the economy cannot exist without us as a society to drive it. And beyond the social sphere, there is the environmental sphere, and we cannot exist as a society without the environment that surrounds us. And so specifically, I like this because it shows, there's a lot of different connections between environmental and social, but because of the way that we interact, like social and economic are completely intertwined.
One of the teachers actually helped explain this visual to me in a way that I think is interesting. He said, you can think of it like this: the environment is everything. Everything is part of the environment. And within that, if you have two or more people, you have a society. And once you have a society, if you're going to do any kind of meaningful interactions between people, that might include trade, for example, then you're going to have an economy.
My husband and I sometimes talk about how we are always outside, even if you're inside, you're outside, because being inside is just kind of like you have these walls around you, but you're essentially always still outside.
I think that's an important thing to consider, because when it comes to addressing sustainability problems, particularly sustainability problems that happen in urban systems, people start to think, what role does the environment play in a system like that? It's all a human-made environment. But that's still the environment. So you can still have an environmental impact, even if it's a completely human-built environment like a city. Yeah,
and also another thing, we have a researcher that worked with us before on urban ecology, and many people see cities as separate, as places that don't have their own ecology, but they do. We still exist in nature. This is still something that has a very specific ecosystem that's associated with the built environment here.
And if we switch gears a little bit from looking at the environmental impact of locusts, we can start to think about the social impacts too. And Dr. Cease gave us a couple of stories. In this clip that you'll hear now, she's going to talk about the impact on education of women and girls in particular when there are locust swarms.
Yeah, and that's something that I alluded to a little bit in the first episode. So it'll be great to hear it for y'all, to hear it from the mouth of the researcher.
It's tough to actually measure and get real numbers for the impact on people of a locust plague. But some of I think one of the most poignant examples I've heard was a study done in Mali, in West Africa, and it was looking at the 1988 desert locust plague, and they compared villages that had been impacted by the locust plague and villages that hadn't, and they found that children born during locust plague years were less likely to start school ever. I think we're talking to teachers, can really understand the impact of having zero formal education. Is pretty dramatic, and as we would expect, sadly, the women are the girls are more affected in these villages. So it could extrapolate from there, but you think about somebody who goes from having a low chance to a zero chance of having an education, and what that means for their future and their family's future. So it can be pretty impactful. So it drives me anyways to continue thinking about how do we solve for all of these multiple outcomes.
So when we talk about the social implications, if you just take that one example, that people attending, or number of people getting education, and that it drops to zero, let's talk about just this one example and then kind of like play that out. How does that specifically, like a social example of children not getting education, how does that impact the economy?
So that's a good question. I don't know, but I imagine that it goes something like this. You have a young girl who has zero education, and as a result of the zero education, the possible job choices that she has, the possible roles in her community that she has are sort of restricted. And
especially when women are impacted in this way, a lot of newer international and sustainable development goals center on educating and empowering women in communities.
Right. So I think when it comes to the impact that the locust plague has on a social system, you have this plague coming in and destroying crops. And that means that the children who are, particularly the young girls who are in communities that are impacted by the locust plague, they basically get no education. They grow up, they become wives. They have children really young. They tend to have more children because education tends to correlate with having children later and having fewer children. And as a result, they may be stuck in a socioeconomic system that doesn't allow for them to prosper.
Right, and not only that, but there's also women that haven't had the same access to education. So women that have had less access to education, there's a certain pattern that kind of goes along with this. And an unfortunate part of that pattern is that they are less empowered, they have less job options, they tend to marry young, and in some cases, they experience domestic violence in a way where they feel trapped. And so Margaret Nussbaum, her approach is to build capacity for women by providing them with specific education opportunities, like trade training. So training in sewing so that a woman can get a job and start providing for her own income, because without her own income, there's no way that she can leave an abusive relationship.
Arianne had a couple of descriptions of why it's problematic when a locust swarm invades a community, and also there's difficulty in having a focused and sustained universal approach to the locust problem. So let's hear what she has to say.
Locusts and grasshoppers are very, very important critical parts of ecosystems. When you have populations build up and then attack agricultural crops, that becomes a challenge for food security. And so that's how I think probably most people might think about locusts. And then when you have that, you can have multiple options for how to respond to them. So one option is, of course, no response. So you can let them run their course. Don't spray them. Try and potentially try and counter the effects of locusts with other means. So we can think about alternative economic sources for communities affected, or aid or things like that. And then our best way of managing locusts at the moment is for very good monitoring and early control programs. So the FAO Locust Watch does a great job of this in managing the desert locust, but it's really a challenging problem. So it's vast areas in the Sahara. So you can imagine what that's like, and you have to go find kind of a needle in the haystack. So you can't survey the whole desert. It's massive, and a lot of these survey teams are on the ground. Locusts, as with most things in nature, aren't concerned with our borders. So they're spread across more than 60 countries. So you have a lot of countries at stake. You have a lot of countries that need to be involved with this monitoring program. And if you have conflict, or so your control team can't get in, or your regular monitoring doesn't happen, and then suddenly a plague arises from a country that hasn't been monitored and enters another country. But ideally, you have this good monitoring program. You go in and you target small groups of young nymphs with a pesticide. Most pesticides that are used are synthetic. There is one fairly good option that's a biopesticide. It's a fungus that specifically targets grasshoppers. But the fungus attacks the locust, but in order to, it's kind of expensive to produce. It doesn't last as long, and it has to be sprayed at a specific time over a specific range of temperatures, or it's not very effective. And so all of those factors make it more difficult to use. And the other thing is, if it's not very widely used, then it's not, the cost of production is going to remain high. So it is used, but not to a large extent. So when you're treating for locusts, if you can treat small areas early on, you can minimize the impact of pesticides on the environment, which are a huge problem actually in Senegal in particular. There's been a lot of studies that have shown the negative effects of pesticides on human health. So there's that angle, but if it's targeted and small, that potentially or probably outweighs the impact. Let's see. So if we treat locusts when they're early on and they're in small areas, and we're using fairly low levels of pesticides, and you prevent a plague versus having $2.5 billion in crop losses and that impact on people. These are the kinds of things you would look at and say, okay, yeah, probably let's do some really good monitoring programs, which is exactly what a lot of really good locust plant protection agencies are doing. If you aren't able to catch the plague early on, and you start to get populations building up, your options move to like aerial campaigns, so spraying from planes. Once the locusts are adults and they have wings and they can fly and swarm, they're much more challenging to target. So you have to use a lot more pesticides over a lot bigger area. So that becomes more challenging.
We're going to switch gears and talk about some of the tools you might need in order to start to analyze the sustainability of your campus or your classroom. we'll use a technique that we've developed that involves two kinds of cycles. And one cycle, which we'll talk a little bit about today, is called the startup cycle. And the other cycle is called the maintenance cycle. And the way that this goes is when you are initially trying to start a sustainability project on your campus, you'll run the startup cycle with members of your community. This could be your students, this could be other teachers or administrators. And once that startup cycle is going, it'll feed into the maintenance cycle. That's really what you'll run through over and over again until you feel like the project has run its course. But I want to stress that sustainability projects, if they're done right, they don't typically have an end point. There's always work to be done. Remember, sustainability problems are wicked problems. They change. You start trying to solve the problem in a particular way, and you realize that there are better approaches, or you realize that there are unintended consequences that you have to address. So there's always more work to be done.
And in sustainability science, we talk about this as adaptive management. So there's a whole slew of articles and research that has been done on how to manage something in a way that is more sustainable. And the general consensus is that you have to do these iterative processes. You have to continually adapt your project. And there's not... And so one of the plus sides of that is that there isn't a failure. There's no failure. There's just kind of learning and then redoing.
So the first step in our startup cycle is simply brainstorming. You might also kind of think of this as a visioning part.
So in this podcast or in this lesson, we've talked a lot about analyzing the problem. How do you start analyzing a problem? But first, what we want to do with sustainability projects is we start off with a visioning stage where you start off with envisioning the future that you want and then move from there into what does it look like now and then how do I get there?
So for example, oftentimes when teachers are working on sustainability projects, what they'll end up with as a starting point is a simple goal. I want to have a zero waste community, or I want to have a community garden that everybody can use. But that's not necessarily a solution to a sustainability problem. That's one part of the solution. If you really want to have a sustainable campus, you really have to do a broader look, right? And so brainstorming is how you do that. And what I recommend is that you bring stakeholders together. This is your students, for example, or students and parents and administrators. And you ask them to work together to brainstorm, to think about what they think a sustainable future for your school or your community should look like. And the idea here is that you have a comprehensive vision that incorporates all of the hopes and goals and values for the people in your community. It's not just you want to have zero waste, it's that you want to have a clean, healthy, supportive school. And so if you're just focused on that one simple goal of getting rid of all of the waste on campus, you're really going to start missing out on the social implications of having a school that, disposes tons and tons of garbage. You're going to miss out on the economic implications of having massive amounts of food waste coming from the cafeteria. There's more to it than just that one simple goal.
And another thing about visioning and brainstorming is that the sky's the limit, and there is no harm in envisioning something that is out of reach, because if you aim high, you're still going to be able to accomplish something.
The next step is deciding how you're going to measure success. And this means that you come up with a metric for evaluating how effective your project is going to be. And if this is a project that focuses on waste, it might be enough to say that you're going to have so much, you're gonna reduce the total cafeteria waste by a certain percentage, but oftentimes it means incorporating more than that. We're gonna reduce the total amount of cafeteria waste by 25% this year. Next year, we're going to reduce it by an additional 25% with the hope of having zero food waste from the cafeteria in 5 years, for example. Or you might also include social impact as well. So not only are you going to reduce cafeteria waste, maybe you're going to encourage students to eat healthier or to bring food from home to school in amounts that they will consume rather than bringing extra that ends up getting thrown away.
Right, and another component of that, if you're talking about eating healthier, many items that are quite healthy also are compostable, whereas some of the items that are more processed and less healthy for us as a society come in non-recyclable containers.
Molly, I'm going to say right now it's a pretty good thing that kale is compostable because it's disgusting.
But
right?
I do like kale. I'm actually trying to grow kale in my garden, but
Yeah.
it's
Well,
failing.
when you're done with growing it, you can just put it directly in your compost bin.
Another part of this startup cycle is performing what we are calling a current state analysis. And this is something that a lot of folks in sustainability do. And it's kind of where we are coming from when we talk to Arianne. She is in the process of not only doing current state analysis of the locust problem, but also trying to implement these solutions with adaptive management.
Right now, we're collaborating with a colleague who is trying to improve recycling programs in a major school district in the Phoenix area. And what he's doing that is really interesting to us is that he's going to the top 6 or 7 most successful schools, and he's doing an analysis of the programs that they have that help make their recycling work. And he's hoping by doing that current state analysis, seeing where recycling bins are, finding out how they're managing their waste, how they're getting students involved. By doing that, he can start to suss out what factors contribute to a successful program.
Right, and that's hugely important because I think that in the past I have seen great ideas, big projects that go full force ahead without doing a current state analysis, and a lot of times people it doesn't turn out the way that they would like, and they feel like failures. And that's not necessarily true, but if you start with a current state analysis, you at least have a good idea of where you are.
As an example of kind of a sustainability fail, a couple of years ago, I worked with a student who was really interested in bringing recycling programs to his school. So he somehow lobbied the school administration to let him put a huge number of recycling bins on campus. And so he did that, and then he found out that nobody's recycling. The recycling numbers didn't actually change. And what he realized is that he hadn't done the current state analysis first. He hadn't sat down and looked at what really is preventing people from recycling. When he did that, when he started to ask students why they don't recycle, when he started to investigate the lack of sorting into recycle bins, etc., what he found was it wasn't that the bins weren't there. It's not that people didn't know where the bins were located. It was actually that people just didn't care whether or not stuff got sorted. And so that's a very different problem, right? So without that current state analysis, he could have invested a lot of money into getting recycling bins that had absolutely no impact.
And I think that also highlights some of the issues that we deal with in sustainability, where some people see sustainability as a ecological problem. There's not the capacity for all of us humans to live here on the planet. But I think what it really is a social problem. Sustainability is a social problem because it is affecting us, and we are the ones that A, are causing wicked problems, and B, benefiting from the Earth's ecosystems.
And finally, the last step is about communication. This is about creating systems of communication, different ways to engage and involve stakeholders, and most importantly, collaboration between all of the diverse stakeholders in a school or a community. Almost every time that I talk with a school that's had a difficulty with recycling, for example, I find that communication is the one area that has been most neglected. And so oftentimes you'll see lots of enthusiasm for recycling, lots of recycling bins posted around campus, but none of that recycling actually makes it into the recycling dumpster outside of campus. So when you look into it, what happens? Well, usually what's happening is that the facilities team isn't always clear on what should go in the recycling dumpster versus what should go in the trash dumpster. And so if you don't have that essential communication, that system of communication between teachers, administrators, students, and the facilities team, then no matter what's happening with everybody else, that recycling just ends up going in the trash.
Right, and I think that touches on something else in our program that sets itself apart from other programs, is that we try to focus on communication, but specifically teachers communicating with each other, and taking it one step further is building relationships. So you're building relationships with people that facilitate easy, transparent, and trustworthy communication between parties. Well, our module next week, we will be discussing sustainable solutions and kind of what that has looked like for Arianne and her research, and some of the implications that has outside of what you're trying to do.
In other words, we'll be talking about how you can prevent a plague of biblical proportions with sheep.